I need you to stay strong. Don't look down, look at the judge.
What happens when the person you trust to deliver the truth becomes the center of the darkest lie imaginable? What if the face you welcomed into your home every evening, calm, polished, confident, was silently hiding a storm capable of destroying the very bond every human depends on, the bond between mother and child? And what if the danger wasn't out there in the world, but living right inside the walls of a family built on secrets, ambition, and quiet resentment? These questions would shake an entire community when a respected Texas news anchor, someone viewers believed they knew, suddenly became the prime suspect in a crime that seemed too twisted to accept. The brutal murder of her own mother. Before the cameras, she was elegance and poise. Behind them, investigators would soon discover a life carefully stitched together with deception, financial desperation, and a need for control that ran deeper than anyone imagined. But long before the public saw her escorted into court in a navy dress and steel-cold stare, the story began in a quiet Austin neighborhood, on a morning that was supposed to be ordinary, June 8, 2023. A tidy home, morning sunlight spilling across the front yard. Nothing unusual, until a frantic 911 call from a daughter claiming she'd found her mother lifeless on the living room floor. She said she'd just stopped by. She said the scene shocked her. She said she didn't know what happened. But the truth was already whispering from the walls, from the untouched locks, from the carefully arranged objects, from the small, deliberate details that only trained eyes notice. And when detectives stepped inside that house, they sensed it immediately. This wasn't a random attack. This wasn't a burglary gone wrong. This was personal, violent, emotional. And someone had tried very hard to disguise it, but disguise only works until real evidence begins to speak. So what was the first clue that shattered the daughter's polished story and exposed a hidden battle no one outside the family ever saw? Detectives are trained to read people, their faces, their tone, their movements. And on that morning in Westlake Hills, something about the daughter didn't match the tragedy in front of her. Most people confronted with the violent death of a parent struggle to even stand, but she stood perfectly composed, like she was preparing for a camera cue. No shaking hands, no swollen eyes. No signs of someone who had spent the last hour crying over the most devastating loss of her life. Instead, officers noticed something else, something unsettling. She kept checking her reflection on her phone, not the body, not the blood, not the police questions, her reflection. It was the first moment investigators felt the air in that room shift, because the woman claiming shock was behaving more like a professional adjusting her image than a grieving daughter processing horror. And then came the second moment, the one that struck experienced officers as completely unnatural. She asked if any media were outside, not who did this, not why this happened, not what the police had found, but whether cameras were waiting. The scene around her mother told a different story. Overturned furniture, scattered papers, a shattered crystal paperweight still sticky with blood, defensive wounds on the victim's arms, a struggle that had been desperate and loud. Yet the daughter stood in flawless athleisure, where fresh makeup, untouched hair, not a wrinkle out of place. That contradiction echoed in every corner of that home, and when detectives looked closer, the crime scene revealed subtle details that didn't match the chaos. Items arranged too neatly, paper stacks deliberately positioned, objects placed with intention. Someone had taken time to fix things, someone who knew exactly what a staged scene should look like, because they cared deeply about how things appeared. Still, investigators didn't want to jump to conclusions. A bizarre reaction could be shock, a staged-looking room could be coincidence, a calm demeanor might simply be her public personality, but then the timeline began to crack. And once it cracked, everything spilled out. What was the hidden message detectives found that pulled this case out of the ordinary and pointed suspicion straight at the woman claiming to be heartbroken? While officers documented the scene, one detective noticed something small, almost insignificant, lying a few feet from the body. A phone, the victim's phone. Its screen was cracked, its battery almost dead, but it held the first real fracture in the daughter's polished story. Inside the messages was a text sent 3 days before the murder, and it stopped investigators cold. It wasn't friendly. It wasn't warm. It wasn't the message of a mother and daughter who adored each other. It read, "I'm done protecting your image. Time for everyone to see the real you. Meet me tomorrow, 7 p.m. No cameras." For detectives, that single message changed the emotional temperature of the room. This wasn't a loving mother calling her daughter over for tea. This was confrontation, exposure, threatening truth. It hinted at a long, simmering conflict hidden behind their smiling photos and public personas. And that message wasn't the only secret the house held. A Ring doorbell camera had captured a 3-second clip, blurry, dark, but unmistakable. A figure approaching the front door at 3:22 a.m. The shape, the walk, the outline, almost impossible to identify. Almost. Except for one thing, the coat. Not just any coat, a striking emerald green trench, an unusual color, the kind designers release in limited runs. Detectives didn't yet know the significance, but the moment they watched that clip, they knew the person in that coat was the key to unraveling the murder. Then, another crack, the estimated time of death. The medical examiner placed it between 3:15 and 3:30 a.m., the exact moment the mysterious figure approached the door. Suddenly, the daughter's calm behavior, her immaculate appearance, the strange staging in the house, it all began to feel less like shock and more like control. And one more detail would soon deepen the puzzle. The daughter claimed she found the body during her morning run, but neighbors reported hearing something at 3 a.m., not a struggle, not screams. An argument, so who was in that emerald green coat, and why would someone return to a crime scene wearing a piece of clothing that bold, that identifiable? Detectives replayed the ring footage again and again. 3 seconds, a shadowed figure, the glint of porch light catching fabric that should have blended into darkness, but didn't. Emerald green, a bold, unmistakable choice, almost theatrical, almost performative, who shows up to a murder scene wearing something so attention-grabbing, someone who believes they can control the narrative. Still, the image alone wasn't enough. The figure's face was obscured, the movement quick, deliberate, but investigators felt the first tightening of the circle, because people who choose dramatic pieces like that coat often wear them publicly. So they began searching. Meanwhile, the daughter, the grieving anchor with flawless posture and photo-ready composure, arrived at the station for a preliminary statement. She walked in with perfect eyeliner, clean running shoes, and the same calm tone she used on evening broadcasts. Not one tremor, not one cracked voice, not one slip of grief. Detectives asked where she had been in the early morning hours. "I was home all night," she replied smoothly, asleep. But her timeline clashed with the medical examiner's findings. It clashed with the neighbors' reports. It clashed with the tension hidden in that threatening text from her mother. And then, as one detective scrolled through social media profiles, a chill ran down his spine. There she was, the daughter, the polished anchor. Smiling in a studio selfie, wearing that coat. A custom emerald green trench, the same shade, the same cut, the same distinctive gold buttons visible in the blurred ring footage, posted just weeks earlier. Captioned with a playful line about making news look good. It wasn't proof, not yet, but it was a beginning. If that coat was hers, where was it now? Detectives checked her apartment building's cameras next, looking for any sign of her early that morning. And what they found turned suspicion into something far heavier. What did the apartment security footage reveal, and how did it place the news anchor exactly where she claimed she never was? When detectives pulled the security footage from the anchor's luxury apartment building, they expected a normal timeline, something calm, something uneventful. But instead, the first clip they opened froze everyone in the room. 2:47 a.m., the building's side entrance. A woman stepping out into the night, head down, baseball cap, hair tucked away, but the posture unmistakable, and the coat. The same emerald green trench that had flashed across the Ring doorbell minutes before the murder. There she was, the daughter who claimed she was asleep all night, leaving her apartment at the exact time the killer would have been on the move. No gym bag, no purse, no companion, just the coat and a purpose. Detectives leaned in closer, slowing the footage frame by frame. Even grainy security cameras couldn't hide her sharp walk, the confident stride of a woman accustomed to bright lights and attention. Only this time she wasn't walking onto a news set. Then came the second clip. 4:05 a.m. she returns, but this time no coat. Gone, vanished, not hanging over her arm, not draped across her shoulders, not carried in her hand. Instead, she held a gym bag, the kind people use when they're carrying something they don't want anyone to see. The same gym bag that later appeared shoved deep into her closet, hidden behind designer heels. The timing was perfect, too perfect. She left her apartment just before her mother's estimated time of death. She returned just after the window closed. Still, detectives needed to hear it from her directly. During her interview, they asked gently, "Are you sure you never left your apartment that night?" Her eyes didn't flicker. Her expression didn't change. Her voice didn't break. "No, I never left. I was home the entire night." A perfect lie spoken with the confidence of someone who delivered thousands of flawless lines on air. And the detectives realized something chilling. She didn't just lie. She believed she could perform her way out of a murder investigation. But the footage was only the beginning. What detectives found inside her mother's home office would expose a much darker motive, one worth killing for. While one team reviewed the apartment footage, another combed through Shannon's home office, the place where the struggle had clearly begun. Papers were everywhere, drawers yanked open, folders missing, and documents scattered as if someone had been searching for something or destroying it. At first glance, it looked like chaos, But detectives quickly realized the mess wasn't random. It was selective, intentional, targeted. Buried under the overturned chair and broken lamp, one detective found a stack of bank statements, some neatly clipped together, others with yellow marker circling signature boxes. Side-by-side signatures, real versus forged, authentic versus imitation, and every forged signature belonged to one person, her daughter, the polished anchor, the grieving woman who claimed she didn't know what happened, the same woman who showed up in perfect makeup hours after a brutal killing. Shannon had been documenting everything. There were notes in her handwriting, confronted Sarah, denied everything, withdrawals increasing, check signature again, and then the most troubling discovery yet. An unsent email drafted to a local station manager, her daughter's boss. The message accused Sarah of forging her signatures, draining her retirement accounts, and running a secret online account that could destroy her career if exposed. Shannon had written, "If Sarah doesn't come clean by the end of the week, I will bring everything forward. I won't protect her anymore." Detectives could almost feel the temperature drop in the room as they absorbed what this meant. This wasn't just a mother's disappointment. This was exposure, ruin, public humiliation, and Shannon was preparing to end the silence. Suddenly, the threatening text made perfect sense. "I'm done protecting your image," and the meeting request, no cameras, a private confrontation, a desperate daughter, a mother who held the evidence that could shatter a carefully curated public persona. The motive wasn't just financial. It was about identity, reputation, survival in a world built on image, a motive strong enough to push someone into darkness. But the office wasn't the only place holding secrets. Detectives soon found traces of something else, something physical, that tied the killer to the scene in a way no performance could erase. Crime scenes can be cleaned, stories can be rehearsed. Alibis can be polished until they shine like truth. But there is one thing no killer can fully control: what the victim leaves behind in their final seconds. As investigators moved from Shannon's office into the living room, the place where she ultimately collapsed, they noticed something every seasoned detective recognizes instantly. Her hands, her nails, her fingers curled in a final, desperate act of defense. Victims who fight back always leave a message. Under Shannon's nails were tiny fragments, skin cells, microscopic fibers, and traces of fabric pulled from the attacker during the struggle. It would take hours before the lab confirmed it, but detectives already knew this wasn't just random transfer. This was contact, violent, frantic, personal, and when those fibers were placed under a microscope, the room went silent. Wool. Silk, high-end, deep emerald green, the exact blend used in designer trench coats, the kind that doesn't just sit on a rack, the kind someone chooses intentionally, proudly, because it defines them. The coat from the Ring camera. The coat from her broadcast selfie. The coat she denied wearing. The coat missing from her closet. It wasn't just in the footage anymore. It was in the victim's hands. Then came another detail, small, almost overlooked, but devastating. Shannon's watch had shattered during the attack. The glass cracked, the strap torn, and the hands frozen forever at a single moment. 3:24 a.m. right inside the window of death, investigators had estimated. Right when the daughter was captured approaching the home. Right when her heart rate spike appeared in Apple Watch data later retrieved. And on the jagged edge of that broken watch, more fibers, more green. More pieces of a truth that couldn't be staged. No matter how perfect her posture, no matter how calm her voice, no matter how steady her lie, her mother had fought to tell the real story, but detectives still needed one thing: the connection between the motive, the timeline, and the daughter's secret life. And they were about to uncover it inside a hidden folder Shannon never meant anyone else to see. While detectives waited for lab results, they returned to Shannon's computer, a sleek laptop still sitting open on the coffee table, its screen frozen mid-document. At first it looked ordinary, like any retired professional's machine. Emails, photos, banking tabs, but investigators knew this wasn't just a device. It was a vault filled with a mother's fears and a daughter's secrets. One digital forensics specialist noticed something odd, a small, hidden folder buried beneath layers of innocently named files. It wasn't labeled Sarah, Finances, or anything suspicious. It was disguised as a routine system folder, something most users would never open. Inside, screenshots, hundreds of them, bank statements, signature comparisons, withdrawal logs. Shannon's authentic signature highlighted in blue, and forged versions, shaky, clumsy at first, but growing more precise over time, highlighted in red. Every signature matched one person, her daughter. Detectives scrolled deeper. The folder expanded, more files, another subfolder. This one titled simply, Insurance. Letters confirming a recent increase to Shannon's life insurance policy, now worth $2.3 million. Sarah was the sole beneficiary. A change made just months before the murder, right when Shannon began noticing unexplained withdrawals from her accounts. Then came the file that made every detective in the room stop breathing for a second. A draft email, never sent. Addressed to a station manager at her daughter's workplace. In it, Shannon laid out everything: the forged checks, the unauthorized transfers, her daughter's financial spiral, and the secret subscription-based account Sarah was running, using her broadcast persona in ways that violated her professional contract and would end her career instantly if exposed. Shannon wrote, "If she doesn't come clean by the end of the week, I will have no choice but to go public." That end of the week, it aligned almost exactly with the night Shannon was murdered. This wasn't gossip. This wasn't speculation. This was motive, documented, organized, undeniable. But what detectives found next didn't just reveal motive. It exposed a psychological unraveling, a woman so deep into her own image that even grief became a performance. Detectives expected shock. They expected trembling hands, unfocused eyes, the kind of grief that makes a person collapse under the weight of reality. But when Sarah Vale returned to her luxury apartment after giving her first statement, she didn't behave like a daughter who had just found her mother beaten to death. She behaved like a woman preparing for an audience. Plainclothes surveillance officers watched her closely that evening. Instead of retreating into silence or curling up in bed, she moved through her apartment with sharp, deliberate energy. She ordered takeout from an expensive restaurant. She accepted a delivery from a high-end boutique. She wasn't slumped or hollow or dazed. She was composed, almost energized. But what she did next chilled every investigator who later reviewed the footage. She positioned her phone toward the window for good lighting, tilted her head slightly, and snapped a selfie. A soft expression, a slight pout, tears absent. Makeup flawless. Then she posted it on Instagram with a caption meant to sound devastated, heartbroken beyond words, taking time to process this unimaginable loss. Within minutes, comments poured in. "We love you, stay strong, you don't deserve this pain, you're in our prayers." But the officers watching weren't fooled. Her performance wasn't slipping, it was sharpening. She checked the comments obsessively, refreshing, monitoring engagement like she was tracking ratings for the evening news. To her followers, it was grief. To detectives, it was branding. And even more disturbing, she didn't cry once. Not when talking about her mother, not when walking through the crime scene, not when posting the photo. Her emotional compass seemed calibrated not to tragedy, but to optics. Detectives began to realize something deeper. Sarah didn't simply want to control the narrative. She believed she was the narrative, and people who believe they can shape reality can justify anything to protect their image, even murder. But just as detectives questioned her strange behavior, forensic teams uncovered something physical, something hidden on the broken watch Shannon wore in her last seconds. In violent crimes, the body tells one story, but the objects a victim wears often tell another, one the killer never meant to reveal. As forensic teams examined Shannon's broken wristwatch, they first thought it was simply damaged during the attack. The crystal face was shattered into sharp, jagged pieces. The strap was torn. The mechanism inside had stopped ticking. But then a technician noticed something remarkable, something that transformed the watch from a simple accessory into a silent witness. The hands were frozen at 3:24 am, not 3 o'clock, not 4 o'clock, exactly 3:24, a moment locked in time. The same window the medical examiner had already estimated for Shannon's death. The same window the ring camera showed the figure in the emerald coat. The same window Sarah's apartment footage showed her leaving and returning. But the time wasn't the only revelation. Embedded in the cracked edges of the crystal, caught like tiny threads in a spiderweb, were fibers. Not random lint, not carpet fuzz. These were high-quality, tightly woven fibers, rich in color, unmistakable under forensic lighting. Emerald green. The room fell silent as the team examined the strands under a microscope. Wool, silk blend, luxury grade, the exact type used by boutique designers who create limited-run trench coats, coats like the one Sarah flaunted on camera and posted proudly on social media. But there was more. On the underside of the watchband, lodged between the torn strap and the metal pins, were skin cells, not Shannon's, cells that indicated a violent struggle. Cells belonging to someone the victim clawed at with everything she had left. Later DNA testing confirmed what detectives already feared. The cells belonged to Sarah. It was the kind of evidence no performance could rewrite, no Instagram post could gloss over, no interview could explain away. A mother had fought for her life, and in doing so, she had marked her killer forever. Every shred of that coat, every trace of that skin, every fiber pulled from that final moment told the same story. The killer wasn't a stranger. But detectives were only beginning to uncover the depth of Sarah's deception. What they found next, hidden inside her financial history, revealed a motive darker and more desperate than anyone imagined. While forensics tied the physical evidence to Sarah, another team followed a different path, one far colder, far clearer, and far more unforgiving than emotions or alibis. Money, financial records don't lie, they don't panic. They don't change their stories. And when detectives opened Shannon's banking history, what they found was not a scattered pattern of withdrawals, but a systematic drain, done slowly, quietly, with precision. Over $180,000 gone in 18 months, retirement funds depleted, investment accounts milked dry, checks signed without Shannon's permission, forged with increasing confidence. The signature comparisons were stunning. Early forgeries were messy, awkward, but as months passed, they grew refined, practiced, polished. Someone had been rehearsing. Someone had been perfecting Shannon's handwriting like a character preparing for a role. And all the forged checks had one name on them, Sarah Vale. This wasn't occasional borrowing. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was theft planned, repeated, escalating. Then detectives saw the credit card bills, luxury spas, designer clothing, cosmetic procedures, injectables, fillers, image maintenance treatments. Tens of thousands poured into maintaining a flawless television persona, and behind that persona, a financial collapse she was desperately trying to conceal. Sarah's salary as a local anchor couldn't sustain any of it. She lived far beyond her means, luxury apartment, leased Mercedes, high-end shopping, all funded not by hard work, but by her mother's stolen savings. But the most alarming discovery was yet to come. Shannon had recently frozen several accounts and filed inquiries with her bank, marking suspicious signatures in yellow highlighter. She had also contacted her attorney about reporting financial fraud committed by a family member, while attempting to minimize the public fallout. And tucked between her papers was a startling handwritten note. Confront Sarah, no more excuses. It was clear Shannon was preparing to expose everything, and Sarah knew it. A career built on image, a reputation balanced on perfection, a financial empire collapsing beneath her feet. Exposure meant ruin, but money wasn't the only secret Shannon uncovered. Detectives soon found a hidden digital life Sarah never intended the world to see, and it revealed just how far she was willing to go to save her image. As detectives pushed deeper into Shannon's files, they discovered something she had been preparing, but hesitating to expose. Not just financial fraud, not just forged signatures. Something far more dangerous to a woman whose entire livelihood depended on reputation. A secret subscription-based account Sarah had been running under a pseudonym, not a casual side project, not a harmless hobby, but a highly curated, provocative online persona, one that used her news anchor identity as a selling point. Detectives recovered the login information directly from Shannon's laptop. Each file contained screenshots, subscriber logs, and images that were unmistakably Sarah, wearing wardrobe pieces viewers would immediately recognize from her broadcasts, sometimes in suggestive poses, sometimes in near undress, sometimes next to props that mimicked the newsroom aesthetic. This wasn't just unprofessional, it was career-ending. Journalists sign contracts prohibiting behavior that tarnishes the station's image. One discovery like this could cost Sarah her job, her credibility, and her public persona, the carefully constructed version of herself she spent years perfecting. Shannon had found it all, and the unsent email to Sarah's boss confirmed it. I'm aware of the online content she is producing. If she refuses to come forward voluntarily, I will. That threat wasn't just a warning. It was a professional death sentence. Detectives understood instantly. Sarah wasn't just facing exposure as a thief. She was facing exposure as a fraud. Her entire identity, the glamorous anchor, the polished storyteller, the respected public figure, was about to crumble. But something else stood out in the files. Shannon had collected months of evidence. She wasn't impulsive. She wasn't vindictive. She was preparing for a final confrontation, a decisive moment when she would force her daughter to come clean. The message she sent days before her death now echoed with chilling clarity. I'm done protecting your image. She wasn't exaggerating. She was ready to dismantle the mask Sarah lived behind, and Sarah could not afford to let that happen. But before detectives confronted her with this discovery, they wanted to understand Sarah's behavior in the hours after the murder. What they found wasn't grief, it was performance. Detectives already knew the evidence pointed toward Sarah. They had motive, they had timeline, they had physical traces tying her to the scene, but they still needed to understand something deeper, why her behavior never matched the tragedy she claimed to be facing. Grief is unpredictable, yes, but it is rarely perfectly composed. On the day of her mother's murder, Sarah walked into the police station with flawless hair, immaculate eyeliner, and the steady voice of someone rehearsing lines rather than reliving trauma. Officers noticed immediately. She didn't tremble, she didn't pause, she didn't fight back tears. She controlled the room the way she controlled a studio. And when detectives asked about her last interactions with her mother, her answers were polished, practiced, almost performed. No hesitation, no cracks in tone, no emotional slips, like she had already scripted what she wanted the detectives to hear. But the most disturbing moment came later that evening, captured by surveillance teams shadowing her movements. Rather than retreat into solitude or lean on someone for comfort, Sarah turned her grief into something else entirely: content. She stood before her apartment window, angled her phone for the best lighting, and took a somber selfie. No smeared mascara, no swollen eyes, no expression of someone crushed by loss. She posted it with a caption designed to tug at sympathy: heartbroken, processing this unimaginable pain. Within minutes, likes and comments flooded in: thoughts, prayers, condolences she consumed with the hungry attention of a performer monitoring ratings. Officers watching the feed realized she wasn't grieving, she was managing her brand. Every move she made after her mother's death had a subtle sheen of choreography, like she wasn't responding to reality, but shaping an audience's perception of it. And for detectives, that was the moment her behavior crossed a line, because innocent people break, they waver, they falter. Sarah adjusted her lipstick, but detectives were about to see something even more chilling: her reaction when confronted with evidence she couldn't pose her way out of. By the time Sarah entered the interrogation room, detectives already understood her pattern. She didn't answer questions, she performed them. She curated her tone, adjusted her posture, softened her expression. Every word sounded less like truth and more like a practiced line delivered to an invisible audience. But part 15 of this story begins with a moment that caught the detectives off guard. They asked her a simple question: "Walk us through your night," a harmless prompt for most people, but for someone who lived on camera, it became a stage cue. Sarah folded her hands neatly, lifted her chin, and with perfect clarity said, "I was home all night. Asleep, I never left my apartment." The detectives let the lie hang in the air for a moment, because they already had the footage. 2:47 a.m., Sarah leaving. 4:05 a.m. Sarah returning without the coat she was seen wearing. They watched her carefully, not interrupting, not challenging, just letting her settle into the false confidence of her own script. Then Detective Anderson slid a single photograph across the table, a still frame from her building's security camera, her profile unmistakable, her distinctive stride impossible to deny. Her emerald coat glowing even in low resolution. For the first time, her practiced veneer stuttered, not shattered, just stuttered. It was the smallest crack, but real. Her eyes tightened, her breath hitched. Her fingers curled slightly as if gripping an invisible cue card. Then, with startling speed, she recovered. "Oh, that," she said, forcing a light laugh. "I forgot. I went for a quick drive, stress. Couldn't sleep," a new lie created on the spot. But detectives had seen enough interrogations to recognize panic dressed up as poise. When they presented the second photo, her returning without the coat, the crack widened, her jaw tightened. Her voice thinned. She crossed her legs, then uncrossed them, then smoothed her dress like she was about to go on air. She wasn't confused. She wasn't grieving. She was strategizing. And with every shifting answer, every manufactured expression, every carefully placed word, she was burying herself deeper. Because a person who tells the truth stays still. A liar keeps adjusting. But detectives hadn't even shown her the evidence that would corner her completely: the data, her own technology, recorded during the exact moment of the murder. Detectives had learned something important about Sarah. She lied with elegance. She lied with posture. She lied with the confidence of someone who believed her voice alone could rewrite reality. But there is one thing no liar, not even a polished news anchor, can manipulate: data. Cold, clinical, emotionless data. And Sarah had been wearing a device that recorded every second of her night: her heart rate, her movement, her location, even the rhythm of her steps. Her smartwatch, when detectives pulled the report, it read like a diary she never meant to write. 3:22 a.m., heart rate spike, 140 BPM, not a gradual rise, a sudden, violent spike. A resting adult doesn't hit 140 BPM at that hour unless they're running, fighting, or in extreme panic. And this spike aligned precisely with the moment the Ring doorbell camera captured the figure in the emerald coat approaching Shannon's home. But the watch recorded more. At 3:24 a.m., the exact moment Shannon's wristwatch froze during the attack, Sarah's watch logged erratic arm movements: rapid, forceful, chaotic. Movements consistent with swinging, striking, struggling. Experts later described it plainly: this is the biometric signature of a physical assault. Then the movement stopped. Her heart rate began to slow, not fully, but enough to suggest the frenzy had ended. Minutes later, the patterns changed again: controlled steps, measured arm motions, the kind of movements someone makes when they're cleaning, staging, arranging. It was as if her watch was narrating the crime scene detectives found. Still, Sarah tried to talk her way around the data. "Devices glitch," she insisted. "Technology isn't perfect. I've done stories about faulty trackers, but there was no glitch. No malfunction. no reasonable explanation for her watch placing her exactly where she claimed not to be, doing things she claimed she never did. The data didn't just contradict her story, it dismantled it. Because this wasn't a witness statement, this wasn't speculation, this wasn't bias. This was her own body telling the truth. But detectives had one more revelation for her, something pulled directly from the victim's nails, something no alibi could ever undo. Technology had already cornered Sarah. Timeline, broken, alibi, destroyed, movements, recorded, heart rate, confessed. But detectives weren't finished. Because while digital footprints can tell a story, a victim's final struggle writes the truth in blood and skin. When Sarah sat across from Detective Anderson, polished, controlled, still believing she could finesse her way through a murder investigation, he slid another envelope across the table. This time it wasn't grainy footage or charts or timelines. It was lab results, DNA analysis. Inside Shannon's fingernails, the lab found 2 genetic profiles, hers and someone else's, someone she fought with, someone she clawed at. Someone she tried desperately to push away. Anderson didn't speak at first. He simply handed her the report. She scanned it quickly, expecting something she could talk around, something she could dismiss, something she could politely deny. But she froze when she saw the name, her own. The room didn't move. The lights hummed. The camera in the corner blinked red. Then something unexpected happened. Her mask cracked, not with fear, but with irritation, annoyance. As if this evidence was an inconvenience rather than the physical imprint of her mother's last living moments. She leaned back, crossed her arms, and with a dismissive shrug said, she was always clingy, not a flicker of remorse. Not a whisper of grief, just irritation at a mother who had dared to hold on as she died. Detective Anderson would later say that moment told him more about Sarah than any fingerprint or lab result ever could. It was the clearest window into her psyche, calm, cold, and theatrically detached. Most suspects react with panic. Some cry, some deny, some shut down. Sarah minimized, as though murder was simply a messy detail muddying her narrative. But detectives weren't done. They had one more piece of evidence, one that didn't come from the scene, the timeline, or the watch. It came from her own boss. Because next, investigators uncovered what Shannon had planned to reveal publicly, something that would not only destroy Sarah's career, but expose the most humiliating secret she had ever tried to hide. The physical evidence had built a devastating case, but detectives still wanted to understand the why, the pressure point that pushed Sarah from fraud to rage to murder. And that answer sat inside an unsent email Shannon had drafted just days before her death. Detective Anderson opened it during the interrogation, turning his laptop towards Sarah so she could see the screen. Her posture straightened instantly, a reflex, as if preparing for a broadcast. But the words hit her harder than any piece of forensic evidence. The email was addressed to the station manager at KTXA, Sarah's employer. Subject line, urgent, regarding Sarah Vale. It started with the financial fraud. Forged signatures, stolen savings, suspicious withdrawals. But that wasn't the part that made Sarah's facade falter. The email went on. I have evidence Sarah has been operating an inappropriate subscription account using her news anchor image. Content that directly violates her contract and would immediately jeopardize the station's credibility. Detectives watched her pupils tighten, because this wasn't just a secret. This wasn't just misconduct. This was career suicide. The account, hidden under a pseudonym, featured curated, intimate content, photographed with the same careful lighting Sarah used in her newsroom intros. Sometimes she wore outfits viewers would recognize from her broadcasts. Sometimes she hinted at story segments or props. Everything was designed to capitalize on her on-air identity. It wasn't only unprofessional, it was scandalous. And Shannon had documented everything, screenshots, subscriber counts, payment logs, even timestamps showing content uploaded from Sarah's work devices. Shannon had intended to expose her, not privately, not gently, but formally to her employer, the email concluded. If Sarah does not come forward voluntarily, I will notify the network by week's end. And detectives realized something chilling. The week's end was the night Shannon was murdered. For a woman who lived through ratings, reputation, and image, who saw herself not as a person, but as a brand, who built a career on perfection, exposure wasn't just embarrassing. It was existential. It meant losing everything, her job, her status, her identity, her applause. It was a death sentence for the persona she'd spent her entire life building. And Sarah wasn't about to let her mother deliver that blow. But detectives still had one final angle to explore, the psychological unraveling behind Sarah's polished smile. What they uncovered painted a far darker portrait than anyone expected. Detectives had uncovered motive, evidence, timelines, and lies, but something still lingered beneath the surface. Something deeper, something that explained not just what Sarah did, but who she had become. Because every piece of this case pointed to a disturbing truth. Sarah Vale didn't just live on camera. She only lived on camera. Her coworkers described her as flawless, disciplined, charming, the kind of anchor who could turn any chaos into a clean narrative. But when detectives spoke to people who knew her privately, the stories changed. Suddenly, she wasn't the calm, polished professional. She was emotionally distant, hypercompetitive, obsessed with appearance, demanding of praise, detaching from reality when criticized. She didn't simply work in the spotlight, she needed it. Colleagues admitted she rehearsed facial expressions in dressing room mirrors. Producers recalled how she panicked if a strand of hair was out of place. Friends said she refused to be photographed casually. Everything had to be curated. One coworker described her chillingly. Sarah didn't have emotions, she had expressions. And that was exactly the person detectives Anderson and Chen saw in the interrogation room, a woman switching moods with the fluidity of a performer adjusting for a live broadcast. Even her responses to tragedy sounded prescripted. My mother was my biggest supporter. Nothing prepares you for a loss like this. I just want justice. All spoken with perfect inflection. All delivered like lines she'd practiced. But the strangest detail came from the forensic psychiatrist who reviewed her behavior. She noted that Sarah spoke about herself in the third person. The public knows the real Sarah. They'll believe my story. Sarah Vale has overcome worse, as though she were narrating her own documentary, as though she were both the anchor and the segment she was reporting on. This fracture between her identity and her persona explained everything: why she posed after finding her mother, why she curated her grief online, why she believed she could lie with confidence, why she thought the courtroom was another stage. In her mind, facts didn't matter, evidence didn't matter, even her mother's life didn't matter. What mattered was the narrative, and Sarah genuinely believed she could shape that narrative into innocence. But detectives were about to confront her with the one thing no narrative could twist: a final piece of evidence pulled directly from inside Shannon's home. Detectives believed they understood the crime. They believed they understood Sarah. But they were wrong about one thing. She had made a single mistake, one she never realized existed. And it was this oversight that would destroy whatever remained of her carefully curated narrative. Shannon's home was equipped with a basic security system, nothing fancy, nothing advanced. Sarah had known about the Ring doorbell camera. She remembered that one. She planned for it. She wore a cap, lowered her head, and kept her face hidden. But she forgot something else entirely. Shannon also had interior security cameras. Small, discreet devices positioned in her hallway and living room. Cameras Shannon used not for safety, but to monitor deliveries and her elderly dog when she traveled. They weren't obvious. They weren't visible. Even regular visitors never noticed them. And Sarah, in her arrogance, never suspected they existed. The footage didn't capture the murder itself. Sarah had disabled the system seconds after entering. But she didn't disable it fast enough. The camera had backed up a few seconds of cloud footage before going offline. Seconds were all detectives needed. The interior camera showed a figure entering Shannon's home with a key, not breaking in. Not forcing entry, using a key, and in the tiny sliver of footage blurred, angled from the ceiling, one crucial detail appeared: an arm, a sleeve, the same emerald green fabric. Sarah didn't speak when the clip was played for her. She didn't adjust her posture. She didn't soften her tone. It was the first time in the entire investigation that her confidence slipped into silence. Detectives pushed further. Only two people had keys to your mother's home, Anderson reminded her. Your mother and you. For a woman who always had a polished answer, a calm voice, a ready smile, this was different. Her jaw tightened, her hands curled slightly. Her eyes flicked toward the camera in the interrogation room, as if searching for someone to perform to. But for the first time, there was no audience to save her. Yet the most chilling moment was still to come. Not evidence, not footage, but Sarah's own words during the interrogation, spoken with a calm so unnatural it stunned everyone who heard it. Interrogations don't always end with dramatic breakdowns. Some suspects shout, some cry, some collapse under the weight of truth, but Sarah Vale, she performed. Even as the evidence boxed her in from every angle: DNA under her mother's nails, biometric spikes aligning with the murder, surveillance footage contradicting her alibi, and interior camera footage capturing her coat, she clung to her persona like it was a lifeline. Detectives Anderson and Chen sat across from her, the room dim and sterile. A silent camera blinked from the corner. To Sarah, that camera wasn't surveillance, it was an audience. So when they laid out the evidence on the table, each photograph, each lab result, each timestamp, they didn't expect her to collapse. They expected resistance, excuses, anger. What they got was something far more disturbing. She looked at the pile of evidence calmly, tilting her head like she was reviewing a news script. Then she smiled, that same delicate, practiced anchor smile viewers had trusted for years, and said softly, "Well, this certainly looks bad, doesn't it? not denial, not shock, not fear, commentary. It was the way she said viewers instead of jurors, the way she addressed detectives like interview hosts, the way she continued as if she were analyzing someone else's tragedy. Then came the moment Anderson would never forget. She leaned slightly toward the interrogation camera, paused for half a breath, and winked. A gesture so wildly out of place, so devoid of emotional reality, that even the detectives froze. It wasn't a nervous tick, it wasn't confusion, it was intentional, a broadcast wink. The kind she used to transition between segments on air. She wasn't confessing to murder. She wasn't denying it either. She was doing something far more chilling. She was acknowledging the story. As if this interrogation wasn't the end of her freedom, but simply another episode in the show of her life. That was the moment detectives understood. Sarah didn't see herself as a suspect. She saw herself as a character, and characters don't go to prison. They go to commercial break. But if her interrogation was surreal, her behavior in the courtroom would be even more shocking, especially when she faced the evidence publicly for the first time. When Sarah Vale walked into the courtroom for her preliminary hearing, people expected tension. They expected emotion. They expected the strain of a woman accused of murdering her own mother. What they didn't expect was a performance. She stepped through the side door escorted by deputies, but instead of looking fearful or hollow, she lifted her chin, softened her eyes, and instinctively sought out the courtroom sketch artists, angling herself the way she did before live broadcasts. Even in a county jumpsuit, she adjusted her posture for them. Judge Vasquez began the hearing, her tone sharp and controlled, but Sarah wasn't focused on the judge. She was focused on the room, on the energy, the eyes, the attention. The courtroom wasn't a place of consequence to her. It was a stage. As prosecutors laid out the evidence, the forged signatures, the ring footage, the missing coat, the DNA under Shannon's fingernails, the smartwatch biometrics, Sarah listened with the same polite concentration she used during interviews with city officials. Not frightened, not angry, just composed. But the moment that left the courtroom stunned came when prosecutors displayed the footage side by side. Clip 1. Sarah leaving her apartment at 2:47 a.m., wearing the emerald green coat. Clip 2, the ring camera capturing a figure in that same coat approaching Shannon's door. Clip 3, Sarah on air later that day, wearing the exact same coat. The courtroom fell into a heavy, collective silence, and Sarah. She turned away from the monitor, looked directly at the sketch artists again, and gave the same gentle, camera-ready smile she used to transition into human interest stories. It was so inappropriate, so disconnected from the gravity of the situation, that even her defense attorney stiffened beside her. To the prosecutors, it was chilling. To the detectives, it was revealing. To the judge, it was alarming. Because Sarah wasn't reacting like a grieving daughter defending herself. She was reacting like a public figure maintaining her brand. Her face didn't say, "I'm innocent." It said, "Make sure you get my good side." But the most shocking moment wasn't her smile. It came from the medical and digital evidence experts, whose testimony would strip away her final excuses. Courtrooms can be swayed by emotion, personality, even charisma. But science has no patience for performance. And when forensic experts took the stand, the illusion Sarah tried so hard to maintain began to crumble piece by piece, each testimony carving away the narrative she'd rehearsed. The medical examiner was the first blow. She described Shannon's injuries in calm, clinical detail, the multiple blunt force strikes, the defensive wounds, the fractured skull. But the part that gripped the jury came next. Some of the blows were delivered after the victim had already fallen unconscious. This was not an accident. This was rage. Rage, a word impossible to reconcile with Sarah's elegant composure. Next came the digital forensics expert, and if the medical testimony painted the brutality, the digital evidence placed the weapon in Sarah's hands. The expert displayed Sarah's Apple Watch data on a courtroom screen. Heart rate spikes, accelerometer patterns, sudden bursts of violent motion, GPS pings, then the timestamp, 3:22 a.m., Sarah within 2 blocks of Shannon's home, 3:24 a.m. Heart rate surges to 140 BPM, 3:24, 3:27 a.m. Rapid arm motions consistent with striking. Sarah's own wrists had told the story she tried to hide. But the room grew colder when the expert played a chilling audio snippet, recorded accidentally when her watch's microphone activated during the struggle, a short breath, rustling papers, and Sarah's voice muttering. "Should have listened, should have kept quiet." Gasps rippled across the courtroom. Sarah's face, unmoved, as if listening to someone else's news segment. Then came the fiber analysis expert. He held up a sealed evidence bag containing microscopic threads pulled from Shannon's broken watch. The exact wool-silk blend used in Sarah's custom emerald green trench coat. Rare, high-end, verifiable. And the DNA analyst sealed it completely. Skin cells beneath the victim's nails matched the defendant, with a probability of misidentification smaller than 1 in a trillion. By the time the experts finished, the prosecutors didn't need theatrics. Science had spoken, and Sarah's mask, polished, practiced, camera-ready, was beginning to slip under its weight. But if the experts dismantled her story, Sarah's own testimony would destroy it completely, in a way no one in the courtroom could have predicted. When Sarah Vale insisted on taking the stand, her attorney nearly begged her not to. No experienced lawyer wants a client like Sarah testifying, someone who believes charm outweighs evidence, someone who thinks the courtroom is just another studio, someone who cannot tell the difference between truth and presentation. But Sarah was convinced she could win the jury the same way she won viewers every night. She walked to the witness stand with the grace of a seasoned anchor crossing a newsroom floor. Even in a conservative gray dress, she adjusted herself the way she always did before going live, shoulders back, chin angled, expression softened. And for the first 30 minutes, she fooled a few people. She spoke of her childhood, of Shannon's demanding standards, of a complicated but loving relationship. Her tone was careful, warm, rehearsed, the voice she used for emotional feature stories. Her attorney guided her gently, trying to keep her within the narrow script they'd planned together. But Sarah wasn't here to follow a script. She was here to write one. When her attorney asked where she had been the night of the murder, she took a breath and delivered a line that detonated the entire defense. "I was home all night. I never left my apartment. Not once." Her attorney closed his eyes, because that lie directly contradicted every strategy he had prepared, directly contradicted the surveillance footage, directly contradicted the timeline. And then Sarah did something even more damaging. When the prosecutor approached for cross-examination, Sarah changed tone, slipping into her crisp, authoritative breaking news voice. Every denial sounded polished. Every explanation sounded like spin. Every answer sounded like she was addressing viewers, not jurors. And the moment that sealed her fate came when the prosecutor played the accidental audio clip from her smartwatch. Should have listened, should have kept quiet. The courtroom froze. The jurors stared at Sarah, searching for a flicker of humanity. But Sarah didn't flinch. She simply offered a cool, practiced smile and said, "That sounds like my news voice. I report on a lot of crime scenes. Maybe it's from a broadcast." It was the most unbelievable answer she could have given, not just because it was absurd, but because it revealed something far more disturbing. Sarah didn't separate her life from her performance anymore. To her, everything was a broadcast, even murder. But nothing prepared the courtroom for what came next: the verdict, the sentencing, and the chilling moment when Sarah faced her fate and reacted in a way no one expected. After weeks of testimony, surveillance footage, scientific analysis, and a witness stand performance that felt more like a primetime special than a murder trial, the courtroom finally fell silent. Everything now rested with the jury. Sarah sat at the defense table with perfect posture, not the stiff, anxious posture of someone awaiting a life-or-death decision, but the confident composure of a woman waiting for her segment to resume. She smoothed her hair, straightened her dress, adjusted her expression into something calm, sympathetic, camera-ready. Even now, facing the gravest moment of her life she was performing, the jury filed in. Not a single eye drifted toward the defendant. They had seen her lies, heard her voice on the smartwatch recording, watched her contradictions unravel in real time, and most damning of all, they had witnessed her chilling emotional absence. The foreman rose. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Sarah Vale, guilty of murder in the first degree." A gasp rippled through the courtroom gallery. The prosecutor exhaled. Detectives exchanged glances. Shannon's friends wept softly. And Sarah? She didn't blink. Not a single emotion crossed her face. No collapse, no outrage, no tears. Instead, she lifted her chin and settled into a serene, almost gentle smile, the smile she used at the end of her evening broadcasts. The foreman continued, "We further find special circumstances: murder for financial gain, lying in wait, premeditation. These special circumstances guaranteed one outcome: life in prison without the possibility of parole." Still, Sarah didn't react. Her attorney placed a hand on her arm, whispering something urgent. She nodded politely, as if acknowledging a producer's note through an earpiece. Then, in a moment so surreal that courtroom observers later described it as haunting, Sarah turned toward the sketch artists, the only visual chroniclers allowed in the room since cameras were banned, and posed. Not exaggeratedly, not mockingly, calmly, softly, a perfect on-air close-up expression. It was as if she believed the verdict wasn't the end, but simply the final act of a story she still controlled. And in that chilling stillness, everyone finally understood. Sarah didn't fear punishment. She feared irrelevance. But sentencing day would expose an even darker truth, because when Sarah was finally allowed to speak, she didn't express remorse, she delivered a monologue. Sentencing hearings are usually somber, heavy, final. They're a chance for the guilty to show remorse or at least to acknowledge the reality of what they've done. But when Sarah Vale rose to deliver her statement, something in the courtroom shifted, a strange, electric tension rippling through every row. People leaned forward, deputies tightened their stance. Even Judge Vasquez watched her closely, sensing what was coming. Sarah didn't walk to the podium like a convicted murderer. She walked like a woman taking center stage. She adjusted the microphone with practiced ease. She smoothed her dress, lifted her chin, and softened her expression into the familiar, polished warmth that viewers had trusted for years. Then she began speaking, not to the judge, not to Shannon's friends, not to the people whose lives she shattered. She spoke as if addressing an audience. Your Honor, and to all those following this story. Not grieving a tragedy, following, her voice wasn't shaky. No grief broke through, no cracks in tone. It was perfectly modulated, her human interest voice. She talked about her mother's legacy. She spoke about public perception. She warned about rushed judgment. She referenced narrative framing, as if this entire murder case were simply a badly edited documentary that had done her dirty. Not once did she mention Shannon by name with genuine emotion. Not once did she apologize. Not once did she acknowledge guilt. At one point she slipped and said, "Viewers, I mean the court must consider the broader implications." It was then that Judge Vasquez interrupted her. "Miss Vale," the judge said sharply, "this is not a broadcast. This is a sentencing for the murder of your mother." Sarah blinked. For the first time, the mask flickered not from guilt, but from annoyance. When the judge asked her directly if she took responsibility for Shannon's death, Sarah responded, "I accept that the court has created this narrative." Created. As if the evidence was a script she disagreed with. As if the verdict was just bad writing. She didn't see a grieving family. She didn't see a destroyed life. She didn't see a murdered mother. She saw a storyline she didn't approve of. And in that moment, the courtroom understood. Her punishment wouldn't break her, because she wasn't living in reality. She was living in a production, one only she could see. But prison would not quiet Sarah. What happened once she entered the correctional system stunned even experienced psychiatrists. Prison is designed to break illusions. No makeup lights, no flattering angles, no curated feeds, no audiences waiting for your next line. For most inmates, reality hits quickly and brutally, but not for Sarah Vale, because Sarah didn't enter prison as a murderer. She entered prison as an anchor without a studio, and within weeks she built one. Correctional officers at the Mountain View unit noticed it first. Sarah never adjusted to inmate life the way others did. She didn't bond, she didn't grieve, she didn't reflect. Instead, she observed, studying routines, spaces, people, as though preparing for a new long-term assignment. Soon, she began hosting segments in the common area, not real ones, imaginary broadcasts. She'd sit at a table, fold her hands neatly, and speak to an invisible camera. "Good evening. In today's update from Mountain View, other inmates watched in disbelief. Some laughed, some were unsettled. But many listened because Sarah spoke with the same polished confidence she'd once used to deliver nightly news. Then it escalated. She began offering to rewrite inmates' personal histories, not legally, narratively. "You're not a killer," she'd say gently. "You're a survivor of a flawed system. Let's frame your story in a way the public can accept." She coached women convicted of violent crimes on how to present themselves as misunderstood protagonists. She taught them how to soften their voices, shape their phrases, angle their lives into digestible story arcs. To her, they weren't inmates, they were characters in a show she was producing. The worst discovery came months later. A guard, later fired, had smuggled in a smartphone, and Sarah had begun recording actual episodes of a podcast she titled Voices of the Voiceless, Women Behind Bars. Under the alias Elise Reed, she narrated highly polished, heavily manipulated stories about inmates, presenting them as victims of injustice rather than perpetrators of violence. The podcast gained thousands of listeners before prison officials traced it back to her, and even as they confiscated the device, Sarah smiled calmly and said, "My audience will be waiting." She didn't just refuse to accept reality, she rebuilt her own inside prison walls. But the most disturbing part wasn't the podcast, it was her psychological evaluation. When Sarah's behavior behind bars escalated, from imaginary broadcasts to manipulating inmates' life stories to secretly producing a podcast, prison officials knew something was deeply wrong. This wasn't normal coping, it wasn't denial, it wasn't even delusion in the traditional sense. It was something far more complex, so the warden requested a full psychological evaluation. Dr. Natasha Reeves, a veteran forensic psychiatrist with decades of experience evaluating high-risk offenders, was assigned to assess Sarah. Dr. Reeves had interviewed murderers, sociopaths, women capable of shocking violence, but nothing prepared her for Sarah Vale. Because Sarah didn't present like a typical inmate, She entered the evaluation room poised, smiling, ready to engage. She sat with perfect posture. She answered questions in a warm, measured tone. She kept glancing toward a blank corner of the room, as if checking her lighting. To her, this wasn't therapy. It was a segment. And when Dr. Reeves asked her the most basic question, "Why do you think you're here?" Sarah responded with a flawless broadcaster's cadence. "To offer insight on my experience for future viewers, I mean, evaluators." Throughout the sessions, she spoke about herself in the third person. The Sarah Vale case. Her story was misrepresented. Viewers would see the truth if shown the real footage, not I. Never I. Dr. Reeves noted something chilling. Sarah didn't appear to understand that she was the murderer, not because she denied the actions, but because she had mentally separated herself from them. It was as if she saw her crime as a storyline written for a character she once played, not an act she personally committed. After months of evaluation, Dr. Reeves wrote a report that startled even experienced correctional staff. Miss Vale displays a condition resembling a personality identity split shaped by long-term media performance. Her broadcast persona has overtaken her authentic self. She no longer distinguishes between performing a tragedy and living one. She called it performance identity disorder, a proposed psychological category for individuals whose public persona becomes so dominant it absorbs their sense of self entirely. To Sarah, the murder wasn't a moral event. It was content, a plot twist, a crisis arc in a storyline she could still shape. That's why remorse was impossible. That's why her expressions were rehearsed. That's why she didn't break. She wasn't the villain in her mind. She wasn't even the protagonist. She was the narrator, above the story, not inside it. And that made her more dangerous than anyone initially realized. But Sarah's story didn't end with the diagnosis. What she did next inside prison forced officials to take drastic measures. Psychiatrists had their diagnosis. Detectives had their closure. The judge had delivered her sentence. But Sarah Vale, she was just getting started. Because while most inmates slowly fade into routine, Sarah began expanding, as if prison were not confinement but a new platform. And the women around her, many vulnerable, many desperate for belonging, became her audience. Her broadcasts grew larger. Her story sessions became organized events. Inmates lined up to tell her their crimes, not to confess but to let her rewrite them. She reframed murder as self-defense. She reframed theft as survival. She reframed violent assaults as misunderstood trauma reactions. Every story she retold sounded cleaner, softer, marketable, and then she escalated again. Using the contraband phone smuggled in by a guard who admired her from her broadcast days, Sarah produced 6 podcast episodes, professionally structured, emotionally manipulative, disturbingly polished. She narrated them not as a criminal, but as a correspondent. Welcome to Voices of the Voiceless, stories the justice system refuses to hear. Each episode reframed hardened offenders as misunderstood heroines swallowed by a broken system. And listeners believed her. Within weeks, the podcast had tens of thousands of followers. Some fans began writing letters demanding these women be freed. Others launched online campaigns questioning Sarah's conviction. The prison cracked. Officials discovered the phone, the recordings, the online following. The guard was fired and arrested. Sarah's privileges were revoked. She was moved to a more restrictive housing unit. But here's what unsettled everyone. She wasn't angry. She smiled. "It's fine," she told Dr. Reeves during a follow-up evaluation. The episode arc needed a twist. Episode, arc, twist. Her life wasn't reality, it was content. Even stripped of tools, Sarah continued speaking to imaginary cameras in her cell. She held daily briefings for an audience that didn't exist except in her mind. She'd look into the corner, lift her chin, soften her eyes. "Let's continue where we left off yesterday." The performance didn't end, it deepened. And prison officials realized something chilling. They weren't housing a woman who had lost touch with reality. They were housing a woman who had replaced reality with her own show. But nothing prepared anyone for what happened years later, when Sarah gave one final interview to the detective who put her away, an interview that revealed just how far she had drifted from truth. Years passed. The public moved on. New stories took over the news cycle. But Sarah Vale remained exactly where the court had placed her, behind the razor wire of Mountain View Unit, serving life without parole. Detective David Anderson, now retired from active field duty, received a formal invitation from the prison. The psychiatric team wanted him to conduct a follow-up interview. Not because Sarah had new information, but because they believed he was the one person her fractured mind still associated with truth. He agreed. When Anderson entered the visitation room, he didn't recognize her at first. Prison life had stripped away the polished glamour, the salon-perfect hair, the immaculate skin, the expensive wardrobe. Without her curated armor, Sarah looked older, sharper around the edges. But the moment she saw him, the performance returned. She lifted her chin, straightened her posture, softened her expression into the same polished warmth viewers had trusted for years. "Detective Anderson," she said gently, "thank you for joining me. I've been preparing today's segment. Segment, not meeting, not interview. Segment." She gestured to the empty space in the corner as if signaling a cameraman who wasn't there. Throughout the conversation, Sarah spoke about her case as if it belonged to someone else. She referred to herself in the third person. The Sarah Vale story was mishandled. The editors framed her unfairly. The narrative focused too heavily on certain scenes. Episodes, editors. She didn't describe her life, she described a production. And when Anderson asked the one question that mattered, a question he'd carried for years, he spoke quietly. "Sarah, do you acknowledge killing your mother?" She paused. A long, precise pause, the kind used before a dramatic reveal on television. Then she smiled a soft, practiced smile and replied, "That's how the writers chose to frame it. Not denial, not confession. Just detachment from reality so complete, it was terrifying." As Anderson left the prison, Dr. Reeves summarized Sarah's condition. She no longer lives inside the truth. She lives inside a show she created, and she cannot escape it. Today, Sarah Vale still broadcasts from her cell. She reports imaginary news updates. She interviews invisible guests. She reenacts courtroom moments for an audience only she can see. The world sees a convicted murderer. She sees a continuing series, a show that will never end. Because in Sarah's mind, she isn't a prisoner, she's the narrator. And narrators don't go to prison. Narrators live forever in their own stories.